All right. Well, for starters, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time. I'm grateful to connect and have you on the podcast, Henry.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Joshua. I like what you're doing.
Well, great. Likewise. And I thought we could just start right with the title of this book, Original Love. What is original love, Henry?
Yeah, great question. I've got to tell you right off, it's a riff on a couple of things. And there's in Zen, there's a Zen has this deep question from way back in its early history. Have you seen your original face that you've had since before you were born? And basically, it's an invitation to recognizing your very own consciousness within which everything you experience is happening. So to see your original face, quote unquote, it's connoting a radical shift in the way you experience any ordinary moment, whereby instead of being totally sort of locked in and engaged in and kind of engrossed in all that you're experiencing, you're actually able to view all of that experiencing from a broader vantage, so that you actually, it's like a release of, so this is getting a little bit technical right off the start, but it's a very important and beautiful experience that human beings can have. It's often called awakening or waking up or realization or even enlightenment, and it sometimes gets these grand names, but it's basically a really significant shift where usually when people first see it, it's a big surprise. You see that you haven't been the self you've always felt yourself to be. That has been itself a kind of experience arising within a much wider context. And that wider context has no time in it. It doesn't do time. It's sort of timeless. Therefore, it's as if it's always been here. So it's original in that sense, right? So that's the original side. Okay, I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but we can come back to it and unpick it a bit more.
No,
And
I
then
love
the
it.
and then the love side is that um, is actually anytime somebody has one of these profound shift experiences where they go from having been tightly locked into their sense of self as a isolated me trying to navigate this world that sometimes gives me what I want and sometimes emphatically does not give me what I want. So that's the challenge of life, really. But instead of being locked into that sense of me, when we're released from that, even if it's just briefly, we get an incredible jolt of well-being. It's not absolutely always like that, but very, very commonly, that kind of shift in perspective brings a strong sense of belonging, of homecoming, of returning to something incredibly fulfilling. And it is a bit like love in a very general sense. It's a kind of unconditional love that, it's a big thing to touch it. And we can, again, go into that as you like, but that's basically what this name, Original Love, is pointing to. It's that experience that there is a kind of well-being that we can tap into that is essentially unconditional. It's not dependent on our conditions. And one of the proofs of that is that people do sometimes find it in very adverse circumstances, and they might also find it in the most ordinary of circumstances. I mean, in my own little biography, which I've written about in another book, actually, called One Blade of Grass, I have various of these moments of discovering this in the midst of ordinary activities, bringing up supper to my kids when they're watching a movie, driving down a motorway in Scotland, and so on. So that, in other words, they don't require specific special conditions such as a long meditation retreat or a dose of psychedelic or something like that. They don't require that. They're actually part and parcel of our ordinary experience. It's just that we're very untrained, non-trained in recognizing it. So that's part of, yeah. So that's okay. That's a little bit of a riff on it.
Yeah, let me follow up. I don't have much of an outline in the way of a conversation today. We'll see where it goes. But I did pull one sentence out of the book, and you write, somehow, however crazy it sounds, the universe loves you. Could you say more on that, Henry?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what I'm trying to get at there is that when we recognize this sort of this I don't know what, we could call it sort of a deeper side of our being, of our actual existence. Um, we recognize that just to be here at all, just to be having experience at all, is a kind of great gift. I mean, I'm not suggesting that there's a giver of the gift that is some, supernal being. I'm an atheist, actually, but I'm very, very convinced that, what this experience is of just having experience, of being conscious, um, is a staggering gift, and it's coming out of the fabric of the universe.
A theme I've heard you talk about. I've listened to you on Waking Up. I've been listening to the audiobook, which I think you did a phenomenal job with. A theme that comes up is resistance. And I'm just curious in the way of, and I have a few, I have a few notes here, and I'd like to follow resistance, maybe throughout. But I'm curious in the way of love. Do we resist it? Is there a resistance there as well? I know resistance, often we think it comes up for like aversion and things we don't want and things we might be uncomfortable with. But what about something as beautiful as love? Do you think there's resistance at play anywhere?
I think there can often be, because to really sort of let in, whether it's from another human being in whatever kind of relationship, it's not only romantic, of course, let alone from the very fabric of this moment, to let in, some sense of love. It requires a kind of vulnerability. It requires a taking down of some kind of, uh, could I call it a boundary? I mean, I think boundaries are generally good, psychologically speaking, but there is some kind of, yeah, letting go or release or even surrender that's involved in it, I think in vulnerability. We don't really want to feel vulnerable, as a rule. We want to protect ourselves from vulnerability. Literally means being capable of being wounded to be vulnerable. So we want to guard ourselves against a wound. But actually, I mean, that's the Latin root of it anyway. But to be vulnerable, I mean, I think a lot of modern psychologists and depth psychologists as well would agree with it, that to be vulnerable is actually healthy. To be open to have a kind of tenderness, alongside whatever fortitude we also need, to forge ahead in life is really part of our overall psychic mental health.
What about practically speaking? The listeners may be familiar with metta practice where we're, this loving practice, loving kindness, expanding out.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we participate in this practice. But what about the idea of receiving it? I don't want to get too abstract, but the thing of, if we thought about it just rationally, a large, large, large percentage of everything and everyone is wishing us well, or at least wishing us no harm.
I
But we
think
don't quite we're not quite aware of it. We don't quite notice. I mean, you could say that relates to love in some way.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's I frame that as being in some ways around support that and connectedness. That actually, um, if we're alive, it means right off the bat we've got sufficient air coming in to allow us to live. It means we've got we're in the right band of temperature. It means we've got the sustenance, the food. We've got enough nourishment. And it means we've got enough moisture. If any of those factors are insufficient, we're dead. So it's very easy to think of ourselves. We're really encouraged, I think, culturally, to think of ourselves as isolated entities, individuals. But in some sense, we do have some kind of agency, and that's okay. But on the other hand, we may be forgetting to recognize our kind of indebtedness. That we're the receivers of thousands upon thousands of factors and causes and conditions and material elements as well as thermodynamic ones, without which we wouldn't be here at all. And one might think, well, so what? I've still got to figure out how to, get that promotion. I still got to work out how to find the partner or be happier with my partner, whatever. Raise my kids right, or whatever the big projects are in your life, But to take a moment to stop and just recognize I'm having existence itself, and to find that is to be the recipient of a whole lot of support, any one piece of which would be sufficient to end your life, if it were absent. I just think it's salutary to remember that and not just take it all for granted. And, you can say, well, yeah, but I'm too busy. But actually, to be too busy to take time for that is really, I would argue, as somebody who often has felt he's too busy to do it, I would argue is to overlook something even more important than all the things we might be busy with, which is that we are currently alive. And you say, well, obviously, but actually that is not really taking it in. If we say, well, obviously I'm alive. No, it is worth paying attention to, that I'm actually a conscious being experiencing a whole lot more than I ordinarily lock my attention into in a rather narrow beam of attention, which are my daily projects and activities. But actually, there is some research on this, that long-term meditators are actually receiving much more sensory stimuli. They're registering them. There are numbers here that I won't quote correctly, but it's of the order of, like, ordinarily people are receiving, a few hundred bits of information, sensory data. But there are actually tens of thousands coming in all the time. And people who've taken on the project of meditating long term, and a lot of this book is kind of on the foundation of a practice of meditation, But that's not the only way to pursue this kind of unconditional well-being. But it is a very good, tried and tested way. That these long-term meditators are just receiving a lot more of the sort of bounty of experiencing this moment at all. And that then sets all the other projects in a different perspective, because there's already something positive for which we can be grateful happening already. So that's, you see what I mean? That's a really different way to be than my well-being is entirely wrapped up in the successful failure of the projects I'm engaged in. I think you see this actually. There's this amazing period of history, the first millennium BCE, when both in Greece, in the Aegean culture where the pre-Socratics got going, and then, of course, in classical Athens, philosophy got going, and the Cynics and the Stoics and the Epicureans and so on, they all took off in 4th century BCE or whenever, but predated by the pre-Socratics, 6th century, 7th century BCE. Around the same time, you had very comparable, not exactly the same, but comparable insight into coming at a kind of less conditional well-being. He had it going on in India and Asia also. And I think it's really cool that right now in the modern post-industrial technologized West, we're starting to tap into all of that again in a very big way. Both the Asian approaches, and to some extent, I've been really happy to see this revival of interest in the Stoics. They've been a kind of pet interest of mine for many years. This really is all about finding a well-being that is not so conditional, that's not so tied into the immediate, success or failure, pleasure or pain of our moment-by-moment lives.
Yeah. I'm curious, you mentioned gratitude or being grateful there. And I was thinking about this, resistance. Like, is it fair to say the opposite of resistance is something like appreciation or something like gratitude? I always feel like that doesn't quite capture maybe what you're talking about.
No, I think you're right on. I might broaden it a little bit and say, I don't know whether this is so well. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a whole lot of research quite on this, but I feel that there's the opposite of resistance, or of not accepting life as it is right now, is number one, gratitude, yes. Number two, this is a really unpopular word, but I think it's quite important for our well-being. A certain kind of humility, a certain kind of like, I do let things be as they are, that I've got the capacity in me to release my opposition, my resistance, and that is greatly helped by, something like humility, if you see what I mean. It's a kind of, I'm recognizing that I don't quite have all the answers, that uncertainty is part of this life, and I'm kind of okay with it, instead of objecting. I'm kind of, I have a certain humility. So I think that's another ingredient. And then the third ingredient, I think, would be something like compassion or love. Be that it's not just about me, I'm concerned for others. And, so my gratitude opens me up to a certain kind of humility. Man, I'm lucky to be getting this at all, this experience, And then certain kind of concern for the well-being of others. They all kind of help one another, in my view, those three things: gratitude, humility, compassion. And I don't hear the word humility, popping up on Instagram a whole lot, But I actually think it has its place. I think it's a very unpopular word these days, because people have maybe negative associations with it, like maybe there's shame associated with it or something. But humility is really different from shame. It's not shame at all. It's really healthy, I think. Anyway, that's my little...
Yeah, it's interesting. I made a note of another resistance piece connected to that around uncertainty. You write towards the end of the book about the beginner's mind and things like that. But there are so many different ways to think. Like, I agree, humility is... I've done a couple episodes on humility in the title. They don't do so well. But skepticism is something that comes up in the way of, doubt, not knowing, beginner's mind. There are so many little similarities. So could you speak a little bit about the beginner's mind?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a term that many people might know. It comes out of Zen, actually. Um, that they really sort of praise the beginner's mind, and I think you know I think some of the big tech founders, like Steve Jobs, were into Zen and into beginner's mind and spoke about it quite a bit. Beginner's mind it's more or less what it sounds like you approach every moment like a beginner, like you haven't done this before and you don't know what the possibilities are. They say, in the expert's mind, the outcomes are few and known, but in the beginner's mind, the outcomes are potentially infinite. The possibilities are infinite because you're wide open. You don't yet know. You haven't locked down into knowing how things should or will go. You actually don't. You're open and not knowing that. So there's a lot of a broader range of possibilities. It's kind of more intrinsically creative, and it's let me see how I could. I mean, I don't want to go off the deep end too much again, but there would be a certain side to this where if we do tap into that so-called original face, which is basically timeless. Like I said, it doesn't. When we tap into this sort of region or register of our own awareness, our own consciousness, that is before all the assumptions and all the content of life has really kind of solidified in our experience. Before that, always here, but kind of it's like taking a step back from the contents of life to this. It's a sort of primordial awareness because it doesn't do time. And so from the perspective of that kind of experience, every moment is new because you haven't got this backlog that you're dragging around with you of known prior experience. You're freer of the preconceptions, the prior assumptions. You're freer of them. And it's a fresh thing to be alive right now. It's not something that it's not sort of mystical and weird and special. It is just this moment, like us chatting like this on our computers, with mics and what I'm seeing, the sort of darkened studio behind you. You're seeing whatever you're seeing behind me, seeing my face. I'm seeing your face. It's just this, and I've also got in my peripheral vision. There's trees outside, a bit of wind here in Santa Fe, sunlight, shadows, a truck outside delivering something. All of that's here in experience. And I'm aware that this sort of whole bubble of experience is arising within a larger kind of receptivity, which is very beautiful. And when we sense this original face, quote unquote, it brings us to beginner's mind, and we recognize, wow, this moment is arising. This moment of experience is happening. And it's beautiful.
It's such a counterintuitive thing, but I think sometimes examples maybe help us in the way of seeing the world without labels. Obviously, labels help us. You walk in the grocery store, you ask where the bread is, and somebody can easily point you in the right direction. But there was a book I read probably maybe a decade ago or maybe more. Anthony DeMello in Awareness, he talks about a child looking at a bird. And at the time, my son was really small, so it's something that related to me. And you'll see like a child maybe looking down at ants or a bird and utterly fascinated, curious, like, what in the world is this thing? and then someone comes up and says, "That's just a pigeon," and that kind of zaps the awe and the curiosity in a way. I mean, would you say even like farther down the path, someone like yourself or similar, there's still a need, like the label is popping up or arising, and then there's like a need to, maybe it happens quickly, dropping the labels a bit to see, what is this moment really? I don't know. Could you say anything that comes up around that?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. It's a beautiful point. I totally agree. And actually, by the way, I think that awe piece also relates to the humility a little bit.
Mm.
The humbler we are, the more easily we get awe-inspired and can wonder at whatever is arising in experience, So that's a really lovely point to make. Thank you. Here's what I would say. It's easy. The mind likes to make things an either or an or. Either or. So like either if I get into this kind of beginner's mind state Henry's talking about, and I'm awestruck by a puddle in the road, and I don't know what anything is, I'm just basking in the marvel of things arising at all, how will I ever cope with life? Someone might think that. But actually, that's not right either. It's perfectly okay. This wider context of experience, of awareness, is totally ready to know that a book is a book and a loaf of bread is a loaf of bread. It doesn't have any problem with that. It's not against anything. It's not, I've got to shut all that down so I can have this marvelous other kind of experience. It's not like that. And actually, there's a really interesting, I don't know whether you or any of your listeners might have come across that book, My Stroke of Insight, by Jill Bolt Taylor, who was a neuroscientist. She was a brain surgeon, actually. And she had a savage stroke that shut down her whole left hemisphere. And for several months, she lived in bliss. She lived in this altered state, which was very like the kind of thing I'm talking about, actually. But then she actually was, amazingly, she recovered. But she then had to sort of retrain herself to be back in the old world and leave that marvelous world behind. But the whole point of a deep training, I think, is and it can really be the case that you do not have to have one or the other. You can totally have both. And I think that's kind of what I would view a sort of integrated, whole, healthy human being that I'm not yet, but I aspire to be. That's what it would be. It's like you haven't lost the childlike wonder. You haven't lost the capacity for deep feeling, because hard things happen in life, and we want to grieve them. We don't want to shut down around. Well, we may feel we don't want to grieve them, but actually it's much healthier to grieve them. And, we're really more open, but that hasn't compromised our capacity to function in the world. And actually, I think it enriches it and enhances it. I mean, I still have a Zen master myself. He's called Yamada Roshi. He's the CEO of a company with 3,000 employees in Japan. It's a very complicated job he's got. And he also is a Zen master who trains kind of 50 to 100 other Zen teachers who want to go and study with him around the world. So he hasn't compromised any of his sort of functionality through having a very deep Zen practice.
I appreciate you sharing that. And it brings kind of a nice transition to a last point I want to chat about before I ask you about wisdom in general. And it's maybe a resistance to fallibility. So, like this thing of like both can exist. The title, Original Love, many people in the West may think of original sin, which I'm not qualified to talk about theologically. There's all sorts of different, definitions. But even just the idea from take it out of theology, like the tendency for human fallibility, like our fallibility, or like the human tendency to even just like desire for certainty over, uncertainty in different things. Um, I don't know, what comes up around both of those and this idea of love existing in an unconditional love thing. As you mentioned, it's unconditional. Like, yes, you're fallible. You haven't, transcended that, and you're likely not going to, but you're still like the love, both of that to throw that out there.
Yeah, lovely. Well, look, a few little things are bubbling up around that. I mean, one is the hazards of perfectionism.
Yeah.
Many a perfectionist doesn't like to acknowledge their own fallibility. I'm guilty as charged. As a young man, I was highly perfectionistic. I think I can claim I'm somewhat imperfectionistic now. I actually
Yeah.
really revel in my many imperfections. I mean, not without wanting to work on them as well. But I there was a great founding cognitive behavioral therapist who does not get enough recognition, I think, these days. Albert Ellis. He was really the pioneer of cognitive behavior therapy. He called it rational emotive behavior therapy. And one of his big things was fallibility, that people get down on themselves so much. And the counter to that is to recognize I am fallible. He actually had this phrase in FFHB, I'm a fallible, fucked up human being. And I accept myself as that. It doesn't mean I don't work on it, but this tendency that we might have, that he was really keen on pointing out, to judge my entire self, to measure my worth. I am worthless because I was late for the bus, which a depressive person might fall into thinking, And I did. I was, my mid-20s, early to mid-20s, I was quite depressed. I was functional, but pretty miserable. And getting exposed to Albert Ellis's brand of cognitive behavior therapy, this would have been like the early 90s, actually, was incredibly helpful. And he always said he was reviving the Stoics. It was as simple as that, where it's not what happens, it's what you think about what happens that upsets you. And it was all about becoming less disturbable. That's the classic Greek term, was ataraxia. Tarasso. I studied Greek, by the way, and the PhD I never finished was in Greek, classical Greek, that is. Actually, Homeric Greek. I was doing Homer. But there's the verb tarasso, which is I troubled. And so ataraxia means untroubledness, or he called it undisturbability, and which is a beautiful way to put it, And one of the main ways that we disturb ourselves, Albert Ellis said, was by saying, I messed up, therefore I'm not good enough. So the double error there is to think that we can get a global rating at all, that I can be judged overall good or bad. And that probably goes back to Judeo-Christian thinking, where the soul is going to get measured at the end of its life, this earthly life. Was it good enough or was it bad enough? Which way will it go? And he points out that's absolutely absurd. We're far too complex, and we're also too dynamic to have any kind of final value, positive or negative. He would say the best thing to do is to do away with any value being given to a person at all overall. Just judge the actions. That's okay. You can assess your own actions. You can assess the actions of others. But you cannot assign a global score to a person. And he would say, not even Hitler. He just did a whole lot of very, very, very bad things. But you still can't have an overall value given to a human being. Too complex. So just do away with that and accept yourself unconditionally, but not your behavior. So So this is a little bit of I don't think it's off track, but it's tangential to the question about original sin. The idea of original sin is absolutely that you've got a global value from birth, and it's not a good one. And your only hope is to accept your Redeemer, or do the prescribed rites and rituals and live the right way, whatever it is. But you're starting off with this sort of infinite deficit. You got to somehow work your way to the good side. I mean, I don't know. I find that not only I can't believe in anything like that, but I also find it's a pretty pernicious doctrine. But I think, on the other hand, the doctrine of accepting fallibility is a very good one, because of course I'm going to mess up. That errare humanum est, to err is human. Actually, there's a further side to that quote, which usually people don't quote. It's errare humanum est, perseverare diabolicum. It's human to make a mistake, to err, but it's diabolical to persevere in one's mistakes. That's actually the full quote, but we don't like that. I would actually say to persevere is just more human error.
Nice, nice. Well, again, I'm grateful for the time, Henry, and this brings us to kind of a standard wrap-up question, so you can take it any way you like. But it's around wisdom. How would you define or think about wisdom in daily life today?
Yeah, thanks. It's a lovely question. I'm so glad that you're bringing it up, and you're one of the people bringing it to our attention, because we've had a terrible deficit of wisdom in the West, I think, for 1,500 years or so, since the church really crushed classical philosophy, and became the one and only. You weren't allowed to do wisdom; you just had to do Christianity throughout Europe. For 1,000 years, 500 to 1,500. The end of reason. There's a great book. Actually, I won't go off on a tangent about that. But it's great that wisdom's coming back. What is it? It's obviously different from knowledge. It's different from science. It's about living. What might it mean to live life well? I think that's basically what the question of wisdom is. And by and large, I would see it as having a sort of two sides. One is this kind of stuff we've been talking about so far a lot, is like, how do you manage your own disturbability? And how do you become able to be somewhat more at peace? And by being at peace, able to relish the gift of being alive more. And indeed to appreciate it more. There's one Zen master called Maezumi Roshi, and he wrote a book that was called Just Appreciate Your Life. Appreciate your life. I think it's quite beautiful. But then, of course, another side to it is, how do we act? How do we behave? And yeah, there's enlightened self-interest, that if you behave kindly to others, it'll probably come back to you. That's okay. If that's your motivation, that's okay. But you can go deeper, I think, and find that there are levels of connectivity that we have that are, of course, expressed in our emotion, in our relationships, but actually they're there anyway. There's a deeper interconnectedness in this world. I sometimes, some biologists talk about this now, that you could actually think about the whole biosphere as a single multiplicitous complex system, that all life is kind of one thing. You can think of it that way, and I would argue that these experiences of the kind we started out talking about, awakening experiences, which involve a sudden radical shift in perspective, where you discover you're not separate. There is a level on which I and what I experience are not actually two things. That's why it's often given the label non-duality, non-dual experience. It's a shift from everything being out there except for me, which is in here. And so it's me in here and everything else out there. Two things, me and everything else. A non-dual experience is when we that sense of me at the middle, in the middle of my experience, somehow is evaporated or seen through, and we get this sense of a oneness, and whether that is framed in some traditions as an awareness, like I was saying earlier, one great awareness that everything's included in. Or sometimes it's called emptiness, that it's a great unknown. It's just a wide openness where who knows what it is, So maybe it's not even anything, or maybe it's, we don't know, but that is, I'd say, that reveals to us such a strong sense of connection with everything else that can become an ethical guiding light, that I don't want to behave towards what is actually in effect part of me in a way that is harmful. So it can become a real foundation for a more ethical way of living. And I think that ethical way of living is its own reward. It makes one feel good to be acting out of a kind of kindness or indeed a love. It makes us feel good. And then I think that good feeling can kind of be a little bit contagious, maybe. And they say that the state of a nervous system is contagious. If we're really stressed and triggered, we might kind of ignite or trigger the same kind of thing in another nervous system, but actually not if we're in a really balanced, regulated place. Then we can feel the triggering in another nervous system, and we're aware enough that it doesn't trigger us. And that can be the way that triggered nervous systems actually calm down, by coming into contact with a non-triggered nervous system. That's what puts an end to the triggering in a nervous system. So the non-disturbability can become kind of healthily contagious. Let's hope. Man, we need it, There's a lot of crazy nervous systems out there,
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful way to wrap it up, Henry. Thank you so much. I'm grateful for your time. Again, the book is Original Love. I highly recommend it. I'll put it in the show notes so it's easy to find. Henry Shukman, thank you again for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks a lot, Josh. Great to be with you.